"Excuse me, are you deaf, old man?" The voice was sharp, lacquered with the kind of impatient entitlement that came from a life of never being told no. It sliced through the quiet hum of the Boeing 777's cabin as passengers found their seats. The man it was aimed at didn't flinch. He was standing in the aisle, a simple canvas duffel bag in one hand, waiting for a family with a fussy toddler to get settled. He looked like a piece of driftwood washed up in a sea of polished luggage and designer handbags, thin, weathered, with a face mapped by sun and time. His clothes, a faded plaid shirt and worn denim, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The speaker, a young man in a suit so sharp it could cut glass, tapped an expensive Italian loafer on the carpet. "I have a schedule to keep. My connecting flight isn't going to wait because you've decided to hibernate in the aisle." "Move." The old man, Jacob, slowly turned his head. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky over a cold ocean, and they held a stillness that was deeply unsettling. He didn't speak. He simply assessed the man, Brent, with a look that wasn't hostile or angry, but something far more unnerving, patient. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a fact, and then turned his attention back to the family, waiting. The gesture, or lack thereof, seemed to infuriate Brent even more. He huffed, a sound of pure disgust, and shoved past, his leather briefcase bumping hard against the old man's shoulder. Jacob barely moved, rooted to the spot like an old oak tree in a storm. He finally shuffled into his window seat, placing the worn canvas bag carefully at his feet. Across the aisle, a woman in a crisp uniform watched the exchange. U.S. Air Force Captain Eva Rostova was on her way to a new posting, flying commercial to save the government a few dollars. She had seen men like Brent her entire life, loud, overconfident, mistaking privilege for strength. But she had also seen men like the one by the window. Not often, but enough to recognize the breed. It wasn't in his clothes or his age. It was in his economy of motion. The way he settled into his seat wasn't the clumsy slump of a tired traveler. It was a deliberate, practiced act of securing his space. His hands, resting on his knees, were gnarled and scarred, but his knuckles were clean. His gaze wasn't vacant. It swept the cabin in a slow, methodical arc, noting the exits, the flight attendants, the other passengers, without ever seeming to move. Brent, now settled in the aisle seat next to Jacob, was already on his phone, speaking loudly about leveraged buyouts and quarterly reports. "Listen, Henderson, you tell them if they don't have the capital by Friday, we walk. I don't care about their projections. I'm not running a charity." He then turned to the flight attendant. "Excuse me? Can I get a whiskey? Top shelf. And can you ask this gentleman to put his bag further under his seat? It smells like a damp basement." The flight attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, looked at Jacob's simple bag and then at Brent's sneering face. "Sir, his bag is properly stowed." Jacob, for his part, didn't seem to have heard. He was looking out the small porthole window, his focus on the ground crew moving with practiced efficiency on the tarmac below, his expression unreadable. The flight took off smoothly, climbing into a vast, brilliant blue sky. Brent finished his whiskey and immediately ordered another, his voice a constant, grating presence in the otherwise peaceful cabin. He complained about the legroom, the quality of the Wi-Fi, and the general inconvenience of having to share air with the public. Through it all, Jacob remained a statue of calm. He hadn't ordered a drink, hadn't opened a book. He just watched the world slide by below. Captain Rostova found her own eyes drawn back to him again and again. She noticed the subtle details that Brent's arrogant gaze would forever miss. There was a small, puckered scar just above Jacob's left eyebrow, the kind that didn't come from a childhood fall. There was a faint, bluish tattoo on the inside of his wrist, mostly obscured by a simple, functional watch. It was so faded with age she couldn't make out the design, but its placement was significant. And then there was his posture. Even sitting, he didn't slouch. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, a posture of readiness so deeply ingrained it had survived the ravages of age. It was the posture of a man who had spent a lifetime on watch. She had seen it in the old photos of her grandfather, a tail gunner in a B-17. It was the quiet discipline of a warrior, a language spoken not with words, but with bone and sinew. Brent, oblivious, continued his performance. Unbelievable, he muttered, gesturing vaguely at Jacob. They just let anyone on these flights. About an hour into the flight, the plane hit a pocket of severe turbulence. The aircraft shuddered violently, dropping several hundred feet in a sickening lurch that sent drinks sloshing and drew a collective gasp from the passengers. The seatbelt sign pinged on with an urgent chime. Brent, whose bravado was apparently only skin deep, went pale. He gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. What the hell was that? He hissed to no one in particular. Are these pilots even qualified? This is what happens when you fly with these budget airlines. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. The plane bucked again, and a woman a few rows back let out a small scream. Captain Rostova instinctively braced herself, her training kicking in as she assessed the situation. It was just weather, nothing catastrophic, but the fear in the cabin was palpable. She glanced over at the old man. Jacob hadn't moved. His expression was unchanged. His hands still rested calmly on his knees. His breathing was slow and even, a deep, rhythmic cadence that was the absolute antithesis of the panic around him. He wasn't ignoring the turbulence. He was experiencing it, accepting it, and remaining utterly unshaken by it. This profound calm seemed to infuriate Brent even more than the old man's earlier silence. It was a rebuke to his own terror. "What's the matter with you?" Brent snapped, his voice tight with fear. "You enjoy this? Too old and senile to even know what's going on." Jacob finally turned his head from the window and looked at Brent. The pale blue eyes were clear, focused, and held not a trace of fear. He said nothing. The silence was his only reply, and it was more powerful, more damning, than any words could ever be. Captain Rostova saw the moment everything clicked into place for her. During the worst of the turbulence, she had noticed Jacob's right hand move from his knee to the canvas duffel at his feet. His fingers, calloused and sure, had traced a complex, looping pattern on the worn fabric. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was a deliberate, controlled movement, a mnemonic device. It looked like he was tracing a coastline from memory, or perhaps the layout of a building. It was a focused drill, a technique taught in the most elite echelons of the special operations community to maintain absolute calm and mental clarity under extreme duress. Her breath caught in her throat. The faded tattoo, the scar, the posture, the economy of motion, and now this. It all painted a picture of a man who was not just a veteran, but something far more. He was a creature of the shadows, a man who had walked in places that didn't appear on maps and done things that were never spoken of. The worn duffel bag suddenly seemed less like old luggage and more like a holy relic, a container of ghosts and memories from a lifetime spent at the sharpest edge of the spear. The man in the cheap plaid shirt was a living ghost, a legend hiding in plain sight, and the fool beside him was mocking him for being old. The dramatic irony was so thick she could taste it. Brent, now recovering as the turbulence subsided, was trying to regain his composure by being even more obnoxious, loudly telling the flight attendant he would be filing a formal complaint. He had no idea he was sitting next to a man who had likely faced death so many times that a little rough air was as trivial as a gentle breeze. Suddenly, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, not with the usual pre-recorded cheerfulness, but with a tone of genuine surprise and awe. "Folks, if you'll look out the windows on either side of the aircraft, you'll see we have a bit of unexpected company." Passengers craned their necks, murmurs of curiosity rippling through the cabin. Flanking the massive passenger jet, flying in perfect, effortless formation, were two F/A-18 Super Hornets. They were sleek, gray predators of the sky, their engines a distant roar, their canopies gleaming in the high-altitude sun. They were so close you could see the pilots in their helmets, turning their heads to look at the commercial liner. A wave of excitement went through the cabin. People pulled out their phones, snapping pictures of the incredible sight. Brent puffed out his chest, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Well, what do you know?" he said loudly, ensuring everyone around him could hear. "Must be an escort for someone important. Maybe my office called ahead. Let them know I was flying through this airspace." Captain Rostova had to physically restrain herself from rolling her eyes. The jets weren't an escort for a businessman, no matter how important he thought he was. This was something else entirely. Military escorts for civilian flights were incredibly rare, reserved for national security events or the transport of a head of state. This was an honor guard. But for whom? Her eyes immediately darted back to Jacob. He was looking out the window, his face betraying nothing, but she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, just for a second. The pilot came back on the intercom, his voice now thick with an emotion Rostova recognized instantly. Profound, unadulterated reverence. It was the voice of a junior officer speaking to a legend. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been in communication with the lead pilot of our escort. They are from the Naval Air Station we are currently passing over. They said they detected a transponder signal they haven't seen in over 40 years, a signal reserved for a living legend. The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Even Brent stopped his preening, a confused look on his face. The pilot continued, his voice cracking slightly. They've asked me to relay a message to a specific passenger on this flight. They are transmitting an old call sign from a very particular unit. The call sign is Golden Wings. The pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 103, the Jolly Rogers, are requesting permission to perform a flyby in your honor. Sir, the term hung in the air, electric and heavy with unseen history. Golden Wings. It wasn't a standard call sign. It sounded like a title, something earned in fire and blood. Every passenger was now looking around, their eyes scanning faces, searching for the hero in their midst. Brent scoffed under his breath. What is this, some kind of movie? He looked around expectantly, as if a four-star general in full dress uniform was about to stand up. Captain Rostova didn't look around. She kept her eyes fixed on the old man by the window. A single, silent tear traced a path through the weathered landscape of Jacob's cheek. He quickly wiped it away with the back of his hand, but the mask of impenetrable calm had finally cracked, revealing the deep well of memory and pain beneath. He kept his face turned to the window, as if he could will himself invisible. But it was too late. The flight attendant, a young woman who looked barely out of her teens, was walking slowly down the aisle, her eyes wide, following Captain Rostova's unwavering gaze. She stopped at their row, her hands trembling slightly. She looked from Brent's confused, annoyed face to the old man's rigid profile. She leaned down, her voice barely a whisper. Sir? Excuse me, sir. Are you Golden Wings? For a long moment, Jacob didn't respond. The entire plane seemed to be holding its breath. Then, with a slow, weary resignation, he turned his head from the window. He didn't look at the flight attendant. He looked past her, his gaze locking with Captain Rostova's. In his eyes, she saw it all. The battles, the losses, the long, silent years. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The flight attendant straightened up, her face pale with shock. She backed away slowly, as if leaving the presence of royalty. A murmur swept through the cabin as the realization dawned. The hero wasn't a politician in a suit. He was the quiet, unassuming old man who had been mocked and dismissed. The man in the faded plaid shirt was a giant. The pilot's voice came over the speaker one last time, filled with unrestrained pride. He's confirmed. Golden Wings is aboard. Through the windows, the 2F divided by a -18S acted as one. With a surge of incredible power, the lead jet pulled up sharply, climbing vertically into the heavens until it was just a speck. The second jet continued straight and level, a solitary sentinel. It was the missing man formation, one of the highest honors a pilot can bestow, a solemn, beautiful salute to a fallen comrade, or in this case, a living one whose legend was thought to have passed into history. It was a tribute to the ghosts he carried with him. The entire cabin was silent, watching the breathtaking display of aerial grace and respect. Brent sat frozen in his seat, his mouth slightly agape. The color had drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly, mottled mix of confusion, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening humiliation. He stared at Jacob, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't seeing an old, deaf man. He was seeing a monument. The cheap clothes, the worn bag, the quiet demeanor. It had all been a disguise, hiding a past so extraordinary it commanded fighter jets out of the sky. The whiskey he had drunk now felt like acid in his stomach. Every arrogant word, every dismissive gesture, every condescending sneer he had directed at this man now replayed in his mind, each one a fresh wave of shame. He had tried to humiliate a legend. He had mocked a hero. He slowly seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. The silence of the old man, now screaming louder than any rebuke. The rest of the flight passed in a new kind of quiet, one born of awe and respect. Flight attendants offered Jacob drinks, snacks, a seat in first class. He politely and quietly refused them all. He asked for nothing. He simply turned back to the window, a solitary figure once more, as the coast of California slid by beneath them. When the plane finally landed and taxied to the gate, the fasten seatbelt sign turned off, but no one moved. An unspoken agreement passed through the cabin. Everyone waited. They waited for Jacob. He took his time, carefully pulling his old canvas duffel from under the seat and standing up. As he stepped into the aisle, people instinctively leaned away, not in disgust as Brent had, but to give him space, to clear a path. Brent remained nailed to his seat, unable to move, unable to meet the old man's eyes. As Jacob walked toward the front of the plane, a man in a business suit stood up and began to clap. Then another. Soon, the entire cabin was on its feet, a wave of spontaneous, heartfelt applause filling the aircraft. Jacob didn't acknowledge it. He just kept walking, his stride even and steady, and disappeared into the jet bridge. Captain Rostova was one of the last to deplane. She saw Jacob standing off to the side, away from the bustling crowd, waiting for the herd to thin. She walked over to him, her footsteps echoing in the terminal. She stopped a respectful distance away and squared her shoulders. She brought her hand up in a crisp, perfect salute, her fingers touching the edge of her brow. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It was an honor to fly with you." Jacob finally looked at her, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his pale blue eyes. He reached out and gently took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "At ease, Captain," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Just a man doing his job. A long time ago, he gave her hand a slight squeeze and then let go. "You keep watching the skies. It's your watch now." And with that, he turned, slung the canvas duffel over his shoulder, and melted into the anonymity of the airport crowd, leaving Captain Eva Rostova standing alone, saluting a ghost.